All right, it looks like our participant number is sort of stable, so we'll go ahead and jump in. Good afternoon, everyone. We're grateful you have joined us for our professional development event, a systems approach to supporting students, educators, and other adult stakeholders in schools. I am Molly Streer, and I am one of the hosts of our workshop today. I use the pronouns she, her, and I am a white cisgender female in my early 40s with chin length, dark brown hair. I'm wearing a black top and my background is blurry. I am the school counseling program coordinator in the Department of Counseling here at San Francisco State, and I am the primary investigator of the school-based mental health branch of our equity and justice-focused counselor training projects. This branch of our project is fully funded by the U.S. Department of Education through a 5-year mental health service professional demonstration grant. I am working alongside the project's co-investigators, Dr. Julie Chronister, who is the coordinator of our clinical mental health counseling program, and Dr. Tiffany O'Shaughnessy, who is the coordinator of our marriage and family therapy program. I would like to introduce and thank our graduate assistant, Kiana Day-Smith, who is supporting our workshop today. And I would also like to thank our other project assistants, Lennon Fanning, Sarah Guerrero, and Jace Perry for their ongoing support of this project. I would like to acknowledge that SF State's campuses in San Francisco sit on the ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone. We further acknowledge that we work and live on the ancestral lands and waters of many other Indigenous peoples and nations. We are committed to ensuring this workshop is accessible to our audiences. Closed captioning is available in the closed captioning option of the bottom of your Zoom screen. If at any time your access needs are not met or become not met during the workshop, please send a chat directly to a host or a co-host. Access is always a work in progress, so we appreciate your comments, feedback, and support. A couple additional things before we begin our workshop today. This is a live workshop, and we will be recording the large group content portions of the event for distribution on our website. We will not be recording the small group components of the workshop. If you are interested in receiving continuing education units for your attendance today, please pay close attention to the announcements provided in the chat for sign-in and evaluation links. The chat function is available for questions, comments, sharing of resources, supportive emojis, etc. We are joined today by a panel of incredible school-based mental health advocates. Guiding this work is Dr. Matthew Lemberger-Truelove, who is a professor of counselor education at the University of North Texas and associate director of the Ronald H. Fredrickson Center for School Counseling Outcome Research and Evaluation at the University of Massachusetts. He is the current editor of the Journal of Counseling and Development and fellow of the American Counseling Association. Dr. Lemberger-Truelove's scholarly work includes 2 published books, more than 70 journal articles, and almost $7 million in funded grants. His empirical work generally pertains to evidence-based counseling practice with children and adolescents, especially in K-12 schools. He is especially interested in culturally responsive interventions that support children, educators, and family members situated in economically challenged environments. We are also joined today by Dominique Hill, who is an experienced school counselor with a master's in counseling from the University of North Texas. Dominique holds a Tennessee State Professional School Service license, Texas State School Counselor certification, and is a Texas licensed professional counselor and National Board Certified Counselor. Her professional journey encompasses impactful roles such as her current position as a UNT Counseling Program Project Coordinator for a multi-million-dollar federal grant, professional school counselor for all levels of K-12 education, and an adjunct lecturer for the counseling programs at University of Texas at Tyler and University of Louisiana, Monroe. Engaged in professional organizations, Dominique has received accolades that include recognized ASCA Model Program and Chi Sigma Iota Outstanding Practitioner Award, showcasing her commitment to program excellence, advocacy, and leadership in the counseling community. We also have Erin Malcolm, who is a PhD student in the counseling program at the University of North Texas. With a Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling, Erin has training and experience working with clients across the lifespan. Though she specializes in supporting victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, she enjoys working with a wide scope of presenting concerns. Her research endeavors revolve around school systems and military families. Erin also serves on the board of UNT's Counselors for Social Justice and belonging to the Chi Sigma Iota National Counseling Honor Society, and she aspires to be an advocate for marginalized populations and strives to cultivate a culture of inclusivity and equity both in and outside the classroom. And finally, we have Dr. Citlali Molina, who is a school counselor, counselor educator, counselor educator, and program coordinator at the University of Texas at Tyler. Her research focuses on culturally responsive social emotional learning, mindfulness, and the overall well-being of students and educators. Drawing from her experience in public education, she delves into understanding teacher-student relationships, particularly through culturally responsive evidence-based interventions such as social emotional learning and mindfulness-based approaches. She also works to empower school counselors to advocate for underserved students and families. Additionally, she has been instrumental in securing almost $2 million in grant funding to support culturally responsive services in schools. In 2023, she was honored with the College of Education and Psychology Faculty Research Award, recognizing her outstanding contributions to research and academia in her field. It is with deep gratitude that I welcome our presenters, and I will hand it to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Molly, and thank you, Tiffany and Julie, for this incredible opportunity. And before we get started, I want to thank my incredible colleagues for doing this with me and for sharing the time, and for all the participants there. This is not a platitude. We greatly appreciate the time that you'll share with us. We know that your lives are profoundly busy, and there's many different stressors and things that affect your lives. And in the spirit of that, we really hope that the next couple of hours are well used, and that we offer some things that will be valuable. So we greatly appreciate it, and we greatly appreciate San Francisco State University and this grant project for hosting our talk today. So our intentions are kind of multifaceted, but I want to, before we kind of get into those things, there's kind of a preface or a caveat that I want to offer folks. Can I move to the next slide, or can we all do that? Or no, I don't think I have permission to do that. There we go. We have some learning objectives, but I do want to offer, from my days as a school counselor, I've always learned that you prepare more than what you can ever probably accomplish in a given time. You do this for a variety of reasons, right? You do this because you want to be attentive to the needs of the participants. And in the spirit of that, there is an active chat mechanism. And so we will be doing our best to try to monitor that. And so if there's any questions, or if things are not resonating, or if, just in general, you want more elaboration, please feel free to do that. So that we can amplify the accomplishment of these learning objectives. But also, when you prepare these, you just never know how timing goes. And so we're going to talk pretty extensively about a particular theoretical approach to school-based mental health and working particularly with the adults. And this particular approach has a couple of different schemes, one of which that we're going to focus most of our time on is those kind of emergent, spontaneous things that as a mental health provider, when we're responding to systems level work, it might help us be more apposite to the needs of those individuals around us. Also, this approach to school-based mental health has some formal curricular structures. So if we have enough time, we're going to, at the end of our presentation, we'll actually present one of those. But even if we don't get to that psychoeducational component, we're going to try throughout this presentation to provide you with a number of resources, including handouts that kind of are a primer or give you exposure to these things, whether we're able to cover that in the next couple hours or not. So with that in mind, our specific learning objectives is kind of as I alluded to, we're going to identify a systems level way of working inside of schools. And schools by their very nature are systemic. I know that there probably are school counselors, school social workers, school psychologists, licensed professional counselors, myriad types of professional individuals. And so we want to make this germane to the full body of folks, like the full constituency of mental health providers. But the particular approach that we're going to talk about is the advocating student within environment approach, which was designed specifically for school counseling, but it has a relevance across various disciplines. And so, again, when we talk about this approach, we're going to talk about it again in terms of how it affects, ameliorates individual conditions, but also how it can potentially change, particularly school systems that are not always responsive to the needs of individuals, including the adults in the system. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about the empirical history, some of the clinical trials, the randomized clinical trials related to this approach, so that you feel some sense of security that this has worked across a variety of contexts and with a variety of different individuals, including children and an adult. And then hopefully we're going to be able to have lots of deep practice on two very basic skills. And in conceptualizing this presentation, I've thought a lot about this in recent years because, like many of you, I've sat through many continuing education and professional development opportunities, and oftentimes walked away very either dissatisfied or, even if I was inspired, pretty dubious to how this translated over into my work immediately. And so our intention is, rather than having this top-down, very hierarchical way of saying this is the best way to work with individuals, we deeply trust that you all are doing incredible things already, and that there were skills that you were trained or that you have your intuitions led you to as a professional counselor. And so rather than trying to transmute, this outside knowledge into your first person experience, our intention is to show how this unique systems level approach to mental health in schools overlays what you're already doing well. And so in particular, we're going to try to look at some of the most ubiquitous, commonplace skills that school mental health providers utilize, but see if we can change it a little bit, adapt it in a way so that maybe is most fitting and germane, particularly in culturally complex school environments. So, we're going to focus specifically on how one might, perform reflections and even open-ended questions in a different way, and show how language affects the ways that we interact with people. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand the next slide briefly over to my colleague, Dominique, who's going to lead a brief discussion.
Yes. So hello, everyone. With that in mind, like Dr. LT stated, we want you all to get something practical out of this presentation and this training, and actually be able to apply it tomorrow if you could. So if you would, please go to our chat and let us know what your expectations are. Let us know what's something that you're desiring from your time with us today, so that we can take that into consideration as we proceed through the presentation.
All right. And as you're writing things out inside of the chat, we'll be monitoring that throughout. I'm going to give you a brief primer on this approach. So the image to your right is a book that was just recently published, but it's a culmination of more than 20 years of work related to an approach to counseling and psychotherapy inside of schools called Advocating Student Within Environment. And it's both an epistemological position, that means a way of thinking about how schools are extant and how mental health providers orientate themselves in working with young people, but it's also a practice approach and offering very tangible skills, including manualized approaches, but then also, again, as I mentioned before, kind of spontaneous language, like the things that you do outside of the formal context, right? When you're just walking down the halls, or when you see a parent or a teacher after school or before school, how we embody these things authentically in multiple environments not only indicates that this is a thoroughgoing and deeply systemic way of working with people, but it also it normalizes people's experiences across contexts. So just as kind of a basic introduction, I mean, we're not going to be able to explicate the total theory, but it's influenced by various disciplines we've pulled from developmental psychology, neurobiology, social anthropology, psychotherapy, particularly from the humanistic traditions, and really looked at how these things are uniquely different in a school counselor context. And because school counselors are embedded in schools, we have a situatedness that is educational in nature, but then also a circumstance, a disposition that is counselor in nature. So in other words, when you're doing something in relationship to the educational mission of a school. Because you're a counselor, there's a more emergent and dialogical process, right? You educate in a very different way. Counterwise to that, when you're counseling, because it's in the context of a school, there has to be this immediate relevance to what's going on in the student's life, whether it's their social emotional development, whether it's the academic mission of the school, whether it's the hidden curriculum, whether it's all those various things that affect students and other educators in their lives. And so really the intention is this of ACE theory is twofold. How do we amplify capacities, right, while at the same time ameliorating social environments? And in counseling in general, we oftentimes talk about advocacy and changing the system's perspective. Now, ACE takes a position, a bidirectional stance in this assertion, that there's a reflexive relationship, that the greatest advocate for change is empowering those individuals within the system themselves. And so helping support utilizing their own inbuilt capacities and the resources, the strength-based resources in their systems, is the most persistent way towards change. Now, while that's a very laudable intent, it could also be naive if just held in isolation, because if we're not changing the systems that surround individuals, it's very difficult for a child, particularly children who are marginalized, to be able to continually push against the edges of unforgiving systems. And so ACE theory then also suggests that school counselors simultaneously, or school-based therapists simultaneously advocate for very tangible and material changes in the environment. So for example, if I'm doing an intervention with a group of young children, then when ethically appropriate and utilizing the most appropriate practices to retain the privacy of children, I'm working with their classroom teachers, I'm working with their family systems so that it can reinforce those skills or those opportunities. A little anecdote from some of my early days as a counselor inside of schools. I was working with a young man, and this was back in my days as a student, and it was kind of a watershed moment and deeply inspired what now became ACE theory, is that this young boy was struggling inside of classes, and his classroom teacher had referred him to me, and he was very excited, and we developed a really strong rapport, and we started working on some skills. And again, this is 20 years removed, and so I'm not quite certain of what it was, but I'm believe it was something like mnemonics or something of that sort. And he felt really empowered that he could go back in the classroom, utilize these skills, and it would translate very immediately into successes that he hadn't had previous to this. And he went into the classroom after one of our meetings, and this was a student who I typically saw on a daily basis. He would stop by even just for a few minutes, and sometimes for a more protracted amount of time. And uncharacteristically, that next day, he didn't stop by. And I didn't want to assume anything. And so I let a few days pass. And sometime into the middle of the next week, I went ahead and sought him out. And he said, when I finally saw him, he said, I was really angry at you. And I was okay with this. Sometimes that happens in the counseling context. And so I inquired a little bit as to what was the nature of the impetus of his frustration. And he said, you know what? He says, I was really excited to try those things out because I thought it was going to work. And what happened is the teacher never called on me, and what ended up happening is I just spent less time in class and got even further behind. And at first I was really perturbed by this, but then as I sat back and reflected on it, I thought, you know what, there probably were myriad opportunities inside of that classroom where the teacher either did give him an opportunity to utilize those skills, or if she did offer them and it wasn't clear to the student, he wasn't able to see the relevance. And so what happened was they were like ships passing in the night. And that, had I worked with the teacher to prime her on the things that we were working with, she could have prompted him very explicitly. When he was successful, reinforced it. And then if he wasn't quite successful, helped redirect it in a way so that he would be more likely to continue to try, or, find an alternative strategy. And so again, this was very much a watershed moment. Now, over the years, ACE interventions are much more sophisticated than this little anecdote, but it really kind of set the tone. And I oftentimes hear, well, that sounds like it takes a lot of time. And later on, we're going to talk a little bit about how that kind of is a misnomer and kind of an illusion, because in fact, the amount of time it takes to not have successful interventions far exceeds having these reciprocal interventions where you are performing advocacy to make successes that occur at the individual level more likely to occur and then be persistent over time, because they have a total dynamic systems effect that reverberates throughout a school. So with that in mind, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the basic axioms, which are curiosity, connectedness, co-regulation, compassion, and contribution. But these will serve as the basis. For the purposes of our presentation today, we're really only going to have an opportunity to focus on one of these as a practice opportunity, and that is how this idea of radical curiosity can help empower individuals, again, as they grow, and how that then in turn affects the total system. But before we do so, my colleague, Dr. Citlali Molina, is going to talk a little bit about some of the recent successes that we've had with some of our ACE studies that she's been a huge part of. So,
thank you, LT. And I do apologize for turning my video off and on. My eye and allergies it's just watering, so I turned it off to not have to record that process on here. So I want to kind of show you all through our current studies that we've used for ACE. There's a lot of them that we've done and conducted, but these are the ones that kind of highlight the potential outcomes of the ACE theory approach. And so the first one is, actually, this is a combination of all the ones that are at the bottom with Bauer, Ceballos, Lemberger-Truelove. But the summary of the outcomes are that these ACE interventions resulted in students' improvement of executive functioning, which are things like shifting between tasks, monitoring themselves, connectedness, feelings of connectedness to the school environment, curiosity, being interested in whether it's social curiosity with others or context of the school setting, and then their achievement. The biggest thing in a lot of these studies is the randomized controlled trials that the treatment group were increasing and improving on achievement, while unfortunately the control group stayed or declined over time, which was really heartbreaking. But that's why you do the delayed treatment, the delayed intervention. So, but it also is a testament to how much of an impact being intentional with the interventions that you use in schools can have on student achievement outcomes, which we know is very important for stakeholders in school settings. And the studies that are listed on this slide and several others that are rooted in ACE theory are typically have been conducted with students from low SES backgrounds, diverse communities from the grades of pre-K all the way to high school in both rural and urban school settings. And to go a little bit deeper on one of the studies, an example of our ACE intervention, it was a 6-week intervention where we did classroom lessons, which were directly rooted in mindfulness practices and social emotional learning. And it was a 40-minute lesson for 6 weeks. So there's not a lot of time input for the output that we received in some of those in this particular study. And we collected 3 data points, pre, mid, and post. So it's something that is low commitment, but very high outcomes. In a school counselor's busy day, it's something that's manageable to do. And to show a little bit of how we kind of prime the environment, as Dr. LT was describing earlier, is we can't just work with the students and try to build their internal capacities, but working with the adult stakeholders in the schools. So another 2 examples of this is we did a similar intervention, but we focused on working with teachers specifically. And it was a 5-week intervention period where we went into their common planning time and we did about a 45-minute intervention to help bring in more social emotional awareness and mindfulness practices, and then the 5 C's that Dr. LT will talk about later. And this study was 30 randomly assigned teachers, and we noticed that the treatment group results reported that they were increased acting with awareness, so they were more aware of their interactions, their feelings or emotions during the time that they were in the classroom with students. They reported a decreased feeling of stress and a decrease in the relationship conflict. So this was during a time of COVID and when students were in and out of the classroom on Zoom classrooms in person. And so that is something that's so important to have the relationship still being built with the students, and the teachers reported that as a decrease in the conflict of the relationship during a time when they were super stressed, as well as the kids were having their own negative outcomes because of what they were going through with COVID. And the teachers in this study reported that they felt a sense of empowerment to not only improve their lives for themselves, but outside of the classroom, and that they could take action in the school building, that they weren't constrained by whatever system they were in. They came up with ideas of how to help provide services to students, to advocate on behalf of their students. And I think that that kind of highlights the main outcome of ACE theory is how do we really empower everybody in a school to create change within the system that they're in, based on the resources and the limitations that they have, to not just feel that they don't have a power in the classroom, outside of the classroom. And they described an ability to cope with adversity, which was so crucial for them to maintaining some of that self-regulation in the classroom when the whole world was falling apart.
The one thing I want to quickly add, because Citlali and I found, particularly with these teacher studies, that we didn't even look for, that was a really kind of cool byproduct, is not only did it change, like all the outcomes that she described here were things that affected their in-classroom behaviors. And those are really profoundly laudable. But as we know, like our personal lives intersect with our professional lives. And all of our studies, from the pre-K teachers all the way through the middle and high school teachers, just spontaneously would report this also affected their lives. Like their marriages were changed, their partnerships with friends and colleagues, things that we didn't even necessarily talk about kind of spontaneously emerged, which again, I think reinforces this idea that we're embedded in systems. And if you can cultivate a capacity, it's generalizable to multiple spaces, but we oftentimes discard people in the various spaces that they exist. So it was really good stuff. And Citlali did some incredible work leading these studies.
Thank you. I did. I guess I was trying to go really fast through it, but the one, if you wanted to just, that sticks out to me, is the participant who noted that while they practice not blowing up or losing their temper in the classroom, they also experience that with their spouse. Like in the moment of like they were going to go for a shouting match, they paused, took a deep breath, and then like were able to verbalize and express what they were wanting to come across in that conversation, rather than sticking with the pattern of fighting match and so on. And that was just one of the little side pieces that came out of it. It was really, really cool. The next part is as we studied, it's been a rough couple of years trying to get into the school systems and doing work with teachers and students. And so we've kind of had to piecemeal it together with working with one subset, students or teachers. But we wanted to look at both. Like, let's capture data from both the teacher and the student perspective. And so we did a study with some folks up in Kansas, which were wonderful school counselors that participated in being trained through the ACE model of consultation. And as you can see here, there were 9 teachers that were in the community planning groups that participated in the consultation intervention with their school counselors. And it was about 50-50 diverse students. And then it was a Title I school. So all of the students were from low SES backgrounds, and marginalized identities, about 42%. And then a little deeper look at the intervention. It was 5 sessions. So again, it's something that's 5 times once a week. It's not very time consuming for a school counselor to participate in this with their teachers. It was a 45 to 40 minutes and over 5 weeks in their common planning periods. The intervention is 15-minute check-in, and we'll hopefully get to it, but if we don't, Dr. LT is still going to share what this intervention, a snapshot of what it looks like. The 15-minute check-in to talk about their experiences over the week, if they have challenges or areas of growth that they experience while participating in the consultation intervention. And then we did the 15 minutes of psychoeducation on the 5 C's, which Dr. LT will talk about this a little bit more in depth. And we also dove a little bit deeper into what a teacher could do for themselves to advocate for themselves and for the school environment for their students. So for themselves and then on behalf and with the students. The last ending part was the mindfulness activity. So 10 minutes of mindfulness intervention. And then we did a closing where they committed to one thing that they could do the next week to help improve the areas that we discussed in the psychoeducation, which I think is where like the sense of empowerment comes from, is to really taking ownership and feeling that you can do something. And then the outcomes. So the first thing that we really wanted to look at was the teacher-student relationship. And the instruments that we used captured both the student perspective and the teacher perspective in that dual relationship. So the teachers, as they reported that their change in perception of the relationship with that particular student was increasing in positivity, the student also reported that the relationship was increasing in positivity, which is really cool because we know educators and whoever's filling it out, yeah, I love all my students. It's great. It's getting better. But if the student doesn't feel it, then it's really kind of a moot point. So it was really awesome to capture that the students also felt that closeness and more positive relationship. And as teachers reported a decrease in the negative perceptions of that relationship with the students also reported that as well, which again, it's a great thing because we know that positive teacher-student relationships can really change the trajectory of a child beyond high school when they graduate and go into the community. So it was really great to see that as an outcome, to know that the teachers saw it that way, but also the students. And lastly, the part that kind of impacts more of academic and then beyond the classroom walls is we saw an increase in the deprivation sensitivity subscale of the 5DC scale. So this was the Kashdan et al. Curiosity dimension scale. And this deprivation sensitivity kind of means that as teachers were more tolerant of stressful situations, they were able to engage in more, not risky behavior, but engage in more challenging behavior so that in an academic setting, they were able to want to challenge themselves versus just staying in a comfort zone and not trying to grow in their academic ability or, yes. And so thrill seeking was another one that was captured, that as teachers were willing to take on a new challenge, a different experience, the students did too. And so the only one that we kind of took out of the subscale results was stress tolerance. It wasn't statistically significant, but we did see a change, very small change between the pre and post sessions. And so hopefully this gives you an overview of like, yes, this works. This is the data that we have to show. And it's something that's a small time commitment, but really, really big outcomes for teachers, students, and both of them together. Thank you.
All right. So just real quickly, I'm going to give some of the basic assumptions, and then we're going to get into, because you all are being incredibly patient. I hear that, the drum roll, the kind of, like, what does this actually look like? So some of the basic assumptions that kind of gets to the practice of this is that agents of schools are co-determinants of experience. Like, we tend to think of ourselves making volitional decisions right now, like, I'm going to do this. And in the way that we talk to people, whether, they're adults or they're children in schools, it's as if people have absolute control over their circumstance. And yet this can be a precarious notion when we start to press on it. So I'm going to do a little bit of a thought experiment here for folks who are sitting out there. Think about your thoughts before you think them. Now, if it sounds like a paradox, it's because it is. And yet we pretend as if we are thinking our thoughts in advance, that we are intentionally deciding what we're speaking. Like, if you were the one here on the other side of your computer offering this, like, I have a sense of the types of things that will come out of my mouth, but I don't know precisely what I'm going to say, right? No matter how many times I've rehearsed it, no matter how many times I've said this in various presentations, there's a kind of spontaneity that seems to emerge. But where does that come from? And it comes from our culture. It comes from languages that I didn't create. It comes from the fact that I'm presenting this to folks through the San Francisco State University project, which I didn't create. It comes from the fact that there are systems of education, again, that I didn't create. So I didn't have absolute control over this, but instead I'm reacting to circumstances that I was thrown into. And so in ways, it seems misguided to suggest that we put people in the pole position to be the primary agents of their own decisions, rather than being more solid, having more solidarity and empowering people to be powerful respondents to their circumstance. In other words, how do we create the conditions? And so we know this from various literatures. For example, one of the most accessible literatures outside of psychotherapy is around, like, pretty relatively controversial topic for some folks, but how do we make choices in a grocery store, right? The best way to motivate change is not to have purchased it in the first place, not to have put yourself in a circumstance. And yet we don't treat people in schools this way. We put them in rather precarious situations and ask them to make very spontaneous, quick decisions to how to make best decisions for their lives. And so ACE is under the supposition that we have to ameliorate the individual capacity to make our choices, to think about our thoughts in advance, but then also how do we create the most prosperous circumstances so that they're more receptive to people as they exist. And there's also more compassion in this approach too. As kind of alluded to, all the individual capacities, whether you're working with a student or an educator, they have to be reflexive to those broader systems. And there's various systems. The things that our kids import into schools, the stressors that they have from home, the cultural messages, the intra-group dynamics. You know, most of this conversation today is going to be around the adults. We think about the various stressors on teachers now in schools where they don't necessarily believe that they have administrator support. There's an outstanding amount of professional development and administrative tasks. There's the deep skepticism about educational systems and the political unrest. All these things are occurring in this profound tapestry that does not necessarily support the individual. And so how do we ameliorate the things that are actionable, that are controllable, so that people are empowered to make sustainable change and make the most opposite decisions as is possible, while at the same time holding the system accountable for the things that was created outside of our personal choice. The idea of student sapience and critical consciousness, this comes from critical theory and, you know, luminaries such as Freire and Fanon and others. But essentially there's this idea, and there's a metaphor I use in one of my books about brisance, and it's a kind of highfalutin term for engineers of explosives. And what they find is that I'm going to give an analogy here that, like, if you put an explosive on the outside of a large boulder, it's going to make a relatively superficial scarring of that big artifice. But if you put that same explosive in the center, because of the reverberation, it destroys the entire rock formation. And the best way to truly transform schools is to believe in and empower the individuals who are embedded within those systems. And so the idea is that, how do we work with the individuals within our systems and empower them in such a way? How do we be curious about their capacities? How do we connect them with other highly capable individuals? How then can we co-regulate their responses to circumstance and have compassion when it's challenging? And then how does that ultimately lead to some type of contribution, like the actionable behavioral side of empowered individuals? And that's our 5 C's. All right. And if you all have questions about this, again, you know, it's all conceptual at this point, but we will get to practice, I promise. So we have a map that we use for advocating student within environment, and we're going to put this, I believe it's going to be an uploaded document that you all can have, and along with this uploaded document, it will have a lot of the jargon defined in hopefully relatively accessible ways. But I'm going to go through this real quickly and also give some example language, because what we want to accomplish today, as I mentioned before, is how do you embody this? Like, how is this a spontaneous way of being rather than just an activity that you do? Like, I was deeply skeptical in my days as a school counselor and as a clinical mental health counselor when yet another project, you know, an academic like myself would say, here, do this, and it would sit on my shelf, or if it didn't sit on my shelf, it would be something that would work, but its shelf life would expire rather quickly. It wasn't sustainable. And so, because ACE is a theoretical approach that is both manualized, but then also helps cultivate capacities of counselors to embody this in a total way throughout systems, there's some spontaneous language. Like, how do we do this when, again, the kids walking down the hallway, when they're, you know, coming into school and they haven't had an appropriate amount of food in the morning? Like, how's there a way of being? In fact, one of my most resonant memories from my days as a school counselor was doing one of those duties that school counselors are not supposed to do, and that was proctoring a test where there was a young girl who I had worked with in I think it was a grief and bereavement group a year or two before then, and she said that she was completely exasperated when I'm walking over there, and she said, "I'm so glad that you're here. Just knowing that you're here, someone who I trust, I can get through this test." Had nothing to do with her academic performance, the interventions that preceded that, and yet from her first person perspective, feeling that sense of connection was able to help empower her to push through that experience. And it had really nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with her inner experiences of this. So student within environment, again, it's an epistemological position that we're always thrown or embedded into our circumstance. And the way to actualize this from an ACE perspective is the reciprocity or the reflexiveness between how we are curious, and curiosity it's defined by various academics in different ways. One of the definitions that I like to pull from is it's a drive state for information, and it's a non-evaluative expression of like inquisitiveness of a person and their circumstance. And so an outcome of curiosity is not like an unchanging ideal reified end, like the proverbial, well, what do you want to be when you grow up, or why did you do that? We don't expect that from an ACE perspective of a young person, because baked into that way of conversing with them is this presupposition that there's a rightness and wrongness, right? There's an evaluative endpoint. Whereas ACE says there is a position that you exist within a system, but it's in constant flux, and that's okay as you interrogate these different positions. And so an example with just a young person, you might ask the open-ended question, what did you accomplish? And that's only minimally curious. Like, it's still open-ended. A person can answer in various ways, but it assumes, it infers this hierarchy that they needed to accomplish something, or that they were able to accomplish something. And imagine if you didn't feel that you accomplished something, you might erroneously report that you did this just to pacify that adult asking based upon that prompt. Whereas a more maximally curious question is how did you experience this opportunity for accomplishment? And so curiosity really tries to crack that nut and open up so that it's not just a singular experience, but it's a systems-based experience. And so what we try to do is we try to encourage elaboration that goes beyond an isolated circumstance, okay? Next is this idea of connectedness. And connectedness is feeling accepted, feeling safe, feeling encouraged, and the respect that's shared between students, the adult stakeholders in the school environment, and the community that's beyond them. The literature has consistently shown that individuals who feel safe tend to be the most socially, academically, and aspirationally successful, even in very deleterious environments. And so it's something that we definitely try to embody in ACE theory. And so how might this be something actionable? I like to give a lot of own anecdotes from my own life. The one that I kind of nowadays use for connectedness, a couple of years ago, my daughter, when she was in, I believe, first grade, we were walking to school, and she said, "Daddy, is it okay to be afraid?" And I wanted to connect with her experience. I didn't want to discount it. But I also know that connection is, again, like all ACE tenets, is fluid, right? And it's complex and dimensional. And so I said, well, of course it's okay to be afraid. It's your body's way of responding to you that there's a potential threat on the horizon, that something could happen. Your body is talking to you, and it's a great teacher. But because it's a teacher, we have to learn from it. And what might be less than okay is responding to that fear in the same way every single time. The best way to respond to that teacher is to say, you know what, here's the information I took from it. I can be afraid, and yet I can still go on. Or I can be afraid and I can find help. I can be afraid and I can have compassion for myself. I can be afraid and know that there's other resources in the environment. And so that's kind of this embodiment of connectedness. That takes a lot of cognitive load, to be constantly curious and to be constantly connected. And so this idea of compassion then starts to follow suit. And compassion, if you deconstruct the etymology of this word, the prefix com means to be with. And passion is the vigor, the energy, the activity, the emotional resonance that we all hold inside of us. Like, there's something that gives us purpose. And so as a counselor, as a psychotherapist, to be compassionate is to be with the passions, like these internal states of the individuals, however elusive they might seem. And so, one example of compassion from an ACE perspective is we like to use little mantras, not as a top-down prescriptive way of being, but as a way to stoke and encourage. And so one that I borrow from one of my great mentors is, don't doubt your ability, try a different strategy, right? So you're acknowledging that a person invested in something. That's that passion part. You're with them, but you're also acknowledging that they're more than simply the immediate manifestation. in a similar way their environment is. Like there's other opportunities, if you slightly look at it with a bend, that you might be able to re-experience your environment in different ways. And that's the within component, the co-regulation. That fancy word underneath of it, basically that just means that there's this energy force within systems that coexist between those external forces, right? So just as there is curiosity, connectedness, and compassion in the individual, we in turn look at the educators, policymakers, guardians, family members, social structures, and how can we be curious there? Like what were their intentions? What things do they hold? What resources are available? How can we connect with those? And how can we acknowledge the growing edges around that? And then the idea of allostasis is different than homeostasis. There's a lot of forms of psychotherapy that tries to seek continuous balance. And while that's a laudable intent, we know that the one constant unchanging thing is that change is going to come. And so allostasis is this idea that we continue to refine and look for new behavioral ways and hold a healthy skepticism. It's like there's a difference between cynicism and skepticism. Cynicism is essentially doubt with pessimism. Skepticism is doubt with optimism, and that's what we want from an ACE perspective. We want to be critical of our environments. We want to be critical that the way that we're operating is going to persistently protect us, and yet at the same time, we don't want to doubt that that's not a great teacher and that it can lead us to different ends. So we'll post something with clear explications of those descriptions here in a moment. I think I kind of went through most of them.
Yes, and I put a link in the chat for the map with the explanations as well. If you guys hadn't seen that, you have access to that.
So this is coming from a person who doesn't tend to use PowerPoints. I've actually went ahead and described the PowerPoint, the next few slides without the PowerPoints. We have a nice, yeah, go ahead. Dominique, I'm gonna let you go on to the Jamboard because you probably know this.
Yes, we can jump into practice now. So I'm about to include a link into the chat, and I'll do that now. And I don't know if you guys have tried Jamboard. Jamboard became really popular for me when I had to do online classes during COVID. And so to me, it's a great way of being interactive with the group when you're not face-to-face. And so if you haven't used it before, welcome to Jamboard. Unfortunately, it's about to go away in October, but until then, we'll continue to use it and have fun. So if you guys can go ahead and click the link, and then I will share my screen and I will guide you guys in this next activity. All right. My screen is showing the Jamboard, not my credit card information, correct? All right, we're good. All right. So with Jamboard, it's a lot of different things you can do as far as like how you can interact with the screen. But for today's purposes, if you guys see over here to the left, my little cursor is circling sticky note symbol, a sticky note icon. And so what I'm going to ask of you guys to do is to click on that sticky note, and you're going to answer the questions, respond to the response that I provide to you using the sticky note. There are quite a few of you guys in here, so try not to make the sticky note really big. You can kind of alter the size and the location. Sometimes when you click the sticky note, it may overlap over someone else's. You can just move that out of the way. But we will be using the sticky note icon over here. Okay. Now, for the first question that I'm going to pose that I would like you guys to answer using the sticky note, I ask that you answer that on the left side of the Jamboard. So I don't, if you see that delicious bacon and avocado and the waffles, that side, Dr. Molina likes the croissants. So on that side of the Jamboard, you will answer the first question. And then on the other side of this line, on this beautiful sunset that Dr. LT likes, or actually sunrise because it's morning, you will answer the second question on that side. Okay. All right, so if everybody's ready, I will begin. All right, so the first question that I need you out to respond to is, what did you have for breakfast today? Not a very tough question. What did you have for breakfast today? And I'll give you a couple minutes to answer that on the left-hand side. Nice. Some of you guys had delicious and healthy breakfast. You can tell we're also talking to people in California, because in Texas, it wouldn't be this healthy. All right, I see some didn't have breakfast this morning. Coffee looks popular. Lots of fruit. It's great. I don't know. One other thing I like about Jamboard is it's anonymous, so you don't have to have fear of like someone recognizing. That's okay. I'm recognizing what it is that you're putting down. But whoever wrote a deep breath, I love that response. Sometimes life is like that. That's all we have time for in the morning. All right. Looks like we're slowing down. All right. So the next question I will ask, please again, respond on the right-hand side over the sunrise. Okay. So this question is, what was your morning experience like? What was your morning experience like today? All right. I know they're coming in on the left-hand side. You guys can just move it over to the right.
I'm quickly trying to move them all.
Ooh, some exercise in there.
I'm having some counterterror strength with the two small kids.
I can relate to the stress, can relate to sleeping through an alarm.
I saw the 3 toddlers. Ooh. That's why there's croissants in the world, for things like that.
Ooh, those siblings will do it to you. All right. All right, so it looks like we're slowing down. Okay, so thank you guys for participating in that. But I want you to spend a couple seconds or a minute or so and just look at the difference in your response on the left to your response on the right. And if possible, we would love for you guys to engage with us. Like to hear more than just our voices. You can either write it in the chat, or if you know, courageous enough to speak, kind of tell us what are some differences that you are seeing, or what are some things that you are noticing between the left side and the right side. Okay. See someone responding. There's a wide range of different experiences. Okay. Someone noticed that the responses on the right side seem to be a little longer than the ones on the left. Okay. The more hectic the AM, less breakfast. That's interesting. I'm going to come back to that one here in a moment. All right. A lot of us seem to be rushing this morning. I think that comes with the profession and working in education in general. That's just life for us, right? But I agree. I see that commonality also. Okay. Some people are stating the more calm and self-care taken in the morning, probably more breakfast they were able to intake. Larger range of information on the right side, yes. Someone said emotions come through more from the right side than on the left. So there's more description there. Yeah. Ooh, I like that. So the right side provides more than just one moment. All right. All right, I think that's still coming. I think that's good. So what we're wanting you guys to kind of take away from this is, and some of you guys have already noticed that you've already noticed and made those comments, but when I asked the question that was very direct, very focused on one thing, like breakfast, I received like pretty much a straightforward answer. Like, this is what my breakfast was, or maybe I didn't have breakfast, right? But did it really give me like an idea or vision into what your whole morning is like? And so the reason why we ask that is that oftentimes, I know as a school counselor, when I'm noticing students are struggling throughout the day, or they're sluggish, or maybe I know something's different with how they're looking. Oftentimes, I know early on I used to ask, what did you have for breakfast? Did you eat? That's always like our first question. We want to meet their basic needs, right? And they may tell us I had a donut, or I had this, or whatever it may be. But what I miss by asking the question that way is what that morning actually looked like. I don't get the information of, well, mom had to go to work early, dad's not there, I had to take care of my brother, so that's why I had to grab a Pop-Tart and run, or we don't have food in the house, so I eat breakfast at school. I don't get the whole context of what's going on or what that child experienced that morning by asking that direct of a question. But when I rephrase and I ask in a more curious manner, then I get more, like someone stated, of the story of their day, right? So I get to know more about your toddlers and the sibling drama you had to deal with. I get to know about how hectic life was for you this morning, and how some were able to sleep in, some slept through alarms. And I just get more context and more understanding behind the individual by asking a more curious, open-ended question, to get a better picture of what that experience was for you, not necessarily that item. Now, I did notice someone say, probably, and my assumption would be the same, that if you had a busy morning, you probably didn't have that big of a breakfast. But I actually have used this in a class setting, and I was proven wrong. Somebody wrote on OneNote that they had like a bacon, egg, and cheese croissant. And I was like, oh, you must have had all the time in the world this morning. And they were like, oh, no. Today was hectic. It was actually from like a 7-Eleven. I was running real fast. I had to get my toddler somewhere, and she told me she had to go use the restroom. So I ran into a 7-Eleven. I grabbed the nearest thing. And so sometimes we can make an assumption just by asking a very direct question, like, what did you have this morning? And assume that they had a nice or, not so nice morning. But again, when we ask more of an open-ended question, like, what was your experience like for you this morning? We get a better understanding and a better picture of what that morning looks like. And so that's really the kind of ACE way of thinking about it, and ACE way to kind of reframe some of the ways that we ask questions, and get a better look at the students that we work with, but not only just our students, but also the way we communicate to the adults in the building that also work with the students.
Yeah, I love how you frame that, Dominique. I mean, the other thing is like there's this like unintentional potential collateral damage when we ask these questions, right? Because as Citlali alluded to earlier, most of our studies are done with children in really disenfranchised economic circumstances. And I'm going to later do a story, but I think this question, just this small, subtle difference in how we asking this question, can illustrate how we can unintentionally force people into responses. Again, that idea of co-determined experience comes to the manifest. You just imagine that kid who is embarrassed about not having access to breakfast, or the kids who are in these food deserts who couldn't even conceptualize this. It's this very well-intentioned question that there, in principle, is nothing wrong with it, but could inadvertently have this domino effect on how the child perceives the environment and how they perceive you as a helper. And we like to, it's a relatively banal question in some way, and yet it has these potential downstream implications that could be unintended. And imagine what it's like when they are more charged questions around, maybe they felt some microaggression in their classroom, or maybe they experienced, an uncaring individual, like an administrator who discounted their capacity to be, an effective teacher by asking these pointed yet information gathering questions without allowing them the opportunity to elaborate. And so what the target we're aiming for with our ACE counseling skills is we still want to gather the information, but we want it to be expansive and defined in the context of the person's lived experience as they live it. I'm always telling my students, even if I'm not going to be surprised because I have my intuitions tell me what the person's going to say, I want the question or the statement that you do as a counselor to make it so that you can be surprised. We can rush through these things, which is good because time is always running away, because I think I've talked about a lot of these.
Do you want to discuss the kaleidoscope here or keep moving?
Oh yeah. Okay. So thanks you, Dominique. She always keeps me on task. A metaphor that we use in ACE is the idea of a kaleidoscope. And there's the kaleidoscopes that manipulate light. We're really talking about the old school kaleidoscopes where you have these two frames that have crystals melted together, and then when the light prisms through it, it changes the circumstance. And this is how I tend to think of individuals within circumstance. Again, that idea of student or educator within a system. And imagine if your disposition, and of course we can't whittle our dispositions down to a single color as a representation, but for the sake of argument, imagine that all that you embody, all that you value, all your resources, your biology, your culture is a yellow crystal. And imagine the circumstance when you go to work, it's like a red circumstance. And of course, it's going to be more sophisticated than that, but just for the sake of illustration. And when those two combined, your yellowness persists, but that red crystal, that red environment changes it. And so it manifests some shade of orange. Now, in a different context, maybe it's with your family, or maybe it's with friends, loved ones, or the antithesis of that, people where it's a not so facilitative environment. Imagine it's a blue. That, again, that yellowness persists, but it manifests green. And that's how it is for people, yet we tend to reduce them and essentialize them to just their yellowness, that you are going to be this while neglecting their circumstance. And so from an ACE perspective, because co-regulation is a foundational supposition, we consider the profound diversity, not just across individuals, but within individuals as influenced by who they are and the context and how it interacts with the context around them. And so this idea of the kaleidoscope greatly dictates how we present ourselves. And this is probably not an unfamiliar idea. We talk about code switching, and we talk about, multiple identities. And this idea of co-regulation is how we can capitalize on the power and authority in both of these conditions, your environmental circumstance, and then also that is you as an individual. So when we later talk about some of the skills around co-regulation, that's kind of what we're talking about, is this kaleidoscope analogy. I talked a little bit about compassion, but just to kind of press down on it just for a second, again, like the cognitive and affective load to just exist in the world is profound. And compassion is that capacity of us to discern. Like there's a difference, later when we talk about some of these skills, there's this idea that embedded within connection and curiosity is this idea of radical acceptance. But there's a deep misconception. In fact, there's very few lines. I'm going to try to find it. Maybe I'll put it in the chat. But very few lines in all of my career that I'm proud of. But one of which is kind of pushing back against some of the criticisms of things like social emotional learning and mindfulness in schools. I think that, don't get me wrong, the way that it's been promulgated in a lot of spaces is deeply inappropriate and has appropriated practices. But there's a misconstrual of what we're saying by saying that the students are to accept things. We're not suggesting that they accept problematic and, again, deleterious circumstances. What we're suggesting instead is that we accept that internal experience, that it's that we can suffer, that we can thrive, that we can be a myriad complex combination of those things. And we're able to discern the difference between over-identifying with our experience, that I am a failure because the school system is failing me, with the circumstance of it. And so compassion is, again, getting in the passion of just existing in one's world and being able to discern the difference between where one is at and all the various possibilities that are available in one's environment. So, and we'll talk about some skills to embody this in a few moments. And then finally, the final C is all these kind of highfalutin ideas are great, but they have to be in practice. They have to be something that people experience. And to truly change systems in a sustainable way, we have to maintain that co-regulation. We just cannot, as much as we want to empower the individual within the system, whether it's the student or whether it's the educator or whether it's individuals stakeholders with more power, it has to be something that is collaborative, because there's a shadow side of just expecting students to be the change agent. What happens when the system is unrelenting and pushes back on them? Also, does it erroneously suggest that the victim has to be responsible for their own healing? But counterwise, it's equally problematic to just suggest that the system will continue to change. Because if the system is the only change agent, like if we are trying to rail against oppressive systems, we've inadvertently disempowered the people who are affected by those systems. And so true change inside of a system has to occur simultaneous. And so we have to empower as much as is feasible. Now, of course, there are times when our privilege and power as helpers is going to far exceed the people who we work with. But as much as is power, as much as is in our power, we want to distribute that. We want to give agency to those who we advocate with. And so contribution is that praxis behavior of changing the systems, and so that it both empowers the individual and hopefully empowers even the oppressive forces, so that they can also maintain a critical conscious space of change. All right. I think we've gotten through all the theory stuff. So because now we've gotten through the theory, the rest of our presentation is really going to be the practice things. It's really going to be us engaging in what these things look like in practice. So we're going to take about 5 minutes, and in 5 minutes, it gives everyone an opportunity to stand up, move their legs, get a drink of water, or, eat on those croissants or whatever you're going to do. But we'll be back. So right now our time is 40 past the hour. So actually, let's make it, it's 38 past the hour. Let's make it 45 past the hour, and we'll be back then. And in Texas, a good thing that wasn't recorded. And then, but still, its own Texas flavor. And we live in, probably, being a professor, it's upper middle class and lots of privilege. But Adam, my wife, is African American, and my heritage is mixed between Ojibwe and white. And so Adam is both similar and dissimilar to a lot of kids inside of his school. And he was playing on the playground, and we later found out that he probably wasn't feeling too well, because he was a little out of character, but not completely out of character, because he's a very gentle-spirited, very helpful boy. And there's one of those climbing, like, pseudo rock walls that are now pretty, commonplace in a lot of school playgrounds. And he wanted to climb up, and there was a little girl, also in kindergarten, who was standing at the top and yelling at him, telling him, "No, you can't come up. No boys allowed. No boys," a few other things that, who knows what was true and not true. But from the recanted story, it was just back and forth between my son and this girl. And so my son, Adam, I'd never heard him say the word "shut up" before, but I know it's not beyond him. He told the girl, after the yelling ensued, to shut up. And the little girl ran to his teacher, or the teachers, who were standing somewhere else in the playground, and had told the teachers that Adam had said "shut up." And so they called Adam over, and Adam, mired in the waterfall of his tears, because he doesn't like to be in trouble, went over to the teachers, and the teacher asked, "Why did you tell whatever girl's name was to shut up?" And Adam proceeded to say, "I didn't." And again, he doesn't typically, respond this way, but he did. And they pushed a little harder. And then he finally said, no, I did say it. And then he proceeded to get the punishment. They use a punishment system in his school. And their punishment system is that they have to run laps, right? Well, they have to apologize first, and then they have to run laps. Now, when I was, the teachers apprised me of the situation, I already had my kind of pre-existing problems with the idea of conflating exercise with punishment, but that's not really what I pressed on. I had asked her, I said, like, I really want to do what's best for Adam so that he benefits from this. So it's not just a perceived punishment, right? It's perceived punishment being taken away from his experience. I want this to be something generative and something that he can grow from. And so when I asked her, what was asked, and I said, well, I wonder if how Adam might respond when asked that question, because her major concern is why he didn't fess up to it initially. And I said, well, I mean, when you ask a person, why you did this, why did you yell shut up, what maybe are the things that's ruminating in this young person's brain? It's an adult figure who is responding to, why is it that you did this behavior that I don't want you to do? As different than, can you tell me what it was like? Or what generated, what inspired you, what influenced you to respond that way? Right? So Adam, in many ways, and again, I'm trying to interpret a 5-year-old, it was kind of a catch-22, right? He was trapped into this corner. If you recall earlier, I was, talking about this idea that it seems like we have volitional control, but he had no control to describe what had happened to him. All he heard in that message was that whoever told first, particularly as a Black child, as a young Black child, who tells first is the one who's ultimately going to be the one who is valued, the one who is respected and gets their side of the story. Now, that doesn't exonerate Adam. He could have responded differently, but what was his takeout? What was his learning? And so from an ACE perspective, and I've worked with the teacher not to punish her, you don't want to punish the perpetrator, was considering alternative ways that would take just the same amount of time. Because I get that teachers have profound numbers of things going on simultaneously in the playground, but what would it have been like how would the tenor of the conversation change if she simply would have said, what influenced your response? What were some of those prior determinants? What were some of those things that affected you? And then she still could have held Adam to, well, in this classroom, we're always forthright. We always tell the truth. She still could have articulated in a very clear way that we don't use language like that. Here's how it could affect people. And it could have engaged a reparative conversation between Adam and the girl. But instead, his one takeaway was, this teacher is not someone I can come to. And so from an ACE perspective, it's how do we help those teachers? How do we give them language while at the same time working with the kids so that it becomes a co-regulated relationship while still holding them to the mores of the classroom, like the ongoing development. All right. So we're going to talk about some specific strategies now, but we, like to use these anecdotes, particularly as we transition out of a break, but to help illustrate alternative ways that this situation could have been handled. And so Erin and I are going to talk a little bit about Rappaport's rules. And ACE has a slight variation. Rappaport was a philosopher and mathematician who looked at how tribal human beings are and how difficult it is to change people's perspectives. Now, his intention as a mathematician was, how do we get people to think differently? How do we have coercive and compelling changes in position? ACE is not trying to manipulate people's experiences, but we can pull from some of this and say, how can we, particularly on the front end of Rappaport's rules, engage the person in such a way that they can, massage through some of these inculcated presuppositions and lead to more flexible alternatives. So I'm going to hand it over to Erin first.
Your face, Dr. LT, is one of the only that I can see. Can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear me? Okay, thank you. So as Dr. LT mentioned, we want to kind of start learning about like putting this into practice. So Rappaport's rules are key in this conversation, kind of when we begin to understand like real life ways to integrate this philosophy into everyday interactions with children in the schools. So some of y'all may be familiar with this, but we begin with this type of listening that can truly only be achieved through entering into someone else's world. So re-expressing, or as many of us know, reflecting back to them what it is we're understanding about what they've shared. And the idea too is that we'd glean enough insight to even extract something deeper than even their awareness had led them to. And so this gets back to the idea of being a co-participant in their world and in their system, and noting agreements and points of connection to further deepen your connection and understanding of them, and ultimately sharing the insights gained. So the key here, in the spirit of honoring their experiences, is actually not to focus on or even go into the fourth point of these rules, which is more oriented around like rebuttal and criticism, because we're in the business of expanding minds, not changing them. So where this framework is certainly valuable, it's significant that we don't use this as a means to change someone's minds or force opinions on them or their experiences. So the last step is often omitted, but by ACE practitioners, that is. But beyond that, you can see how this model, much like reflective listening practices, could elicit a more sustainable connection with the person over time. Also important, and yet another avenue of promoting growth and learning in the child, which is obviously paramount in this. But Dr. LT, I'm wondering what you have to add here on this slide.
Yeah, I mean, the key here is trying to break through our own predisposed biases. And, I was once asked, I had a colleague who unfortunately had a psychotic break. And I was asked by the ADA investigators about some of the circumstances. And they're like, they asked me if I believed what was going on with the person, because they had gotten to such a vexed state that they couldn't even advocate for themselves. And my response was, I don't have to believe what he believes to believe that he believes it. And that's kind of what the Rappaport's rules are suggesting, is that you have to suspend your own beliefs in some ways, and that you're restating your interlocutor's position in such a way that it even would clarify in a more pithy way their position, right? And yeah, this reflects the classical humanistic ideas of reflective listening, but it really kind of goes beyond that, right? It's more than just empathy. It really is, how do you show solidarity? Like, how do you demonstrate that we are a we in this conversation, that we are co-determining this conversation so that it can be expansive?
So now that we've focused on kind of like the individual level, we want to now broaden this out to like larger systems within school environments. And so, because of course the school system is comprised of so many influential collaborators outside of even teachers. So talking about some markers of this framework, this approach systemically grounds all school system members to be aligned with the vision of the school itself, and even beyond the walls of the school. It's advocacy focused. So this transitions to the idea that this is a theory of practice and a theory of being, as you will likely hear again. So this essence of the C's that we've established today is really the heart behind this, that if we can truly embody what it means to enter into another human's experience, it would then inform and pave the way for future meaningful interactions between you and any one piece of that system. And so as we talk about the practices of this approach, it's rooted in the goal of arming folks with skill sets that will promote the development of the collective internal capacity of the school system. So to discuss a brief example, and this is very similar to what Dr. LT was sharing, but let's say child A is microaggressed by child B. As we discuss the systems approach, it's important to note the role of the stakeholder that we're discussing. So whether a teacher or administrator, they'd be working with both students, and again, would use this moment as a means to establish a collaborative and working relationship with the children. So we would attempt to understand each child's experience of the occurrence while establishing ourselves as an individual who would who could connect with those child in future situations. And so the experience of the child would be less in turn oriented around, I'm in trouble, I did something bad, and more, I've been understood and accepted and am open to new ways of operating in the future, in more childlike language, of course, because the promotion of growth and learning for the children in this obviously is paramount. And so we have said this before, but of course, this process would take more time than we're used to, but the hope would be that this approach is a more sustainable method of addressing the matter in the first place. So we're proposing it's 5 more minutes in one moment than the cumulative hour from variations of the same event occurring over time. And I do also want to once more throw it back to Dr. LT and see if you have anything to add on this as well.
Yeah, and what I'm going to say here is not intended to be a hot take. But it could be misconstrued as such. I oftentimes hear school-based mental health practitioners say, well, because of the constraints in a school, I have to be solution-focused. And they're oftentimes conflating solution-focused brief therapy, which is postmodern and actually much more elaborative and sophisticated, versus what oftentimes occurs in a school, and that is, I just need to get to results, right? But what we find, though, is that those results, when they're top down and when they're not situated in the cultural context, is they have a short shelf life. In fact, even if we look at psychotherapeutic outcomes in general, outside of a school context and even inside and outside of a clinical setting. So that means the most highly controlled studies have showed that the outcomes of clinical interventions are only 8 months. And that's not because, and it's largely attributed to, we haven't affected the social systems. People go back into the circumstance. And so this idea that it might take a few more moments, that after you've worked with a kid, to go to their teacher and work with them as well. And that's not to say, oh, I told Jimmy to do this, and now that teacher can strong arm Jimmy with that information. That's the opposite of what you do. No, instead, what we're suggesting is here are the types of things that you can do, empower the individual without even having to necessarily name Jimmy and compromise Jimmy's autonomy and privacy, but instead empower both individuals to be creating a culture of synergy where they're working together. And so that might take a little bit more time, but ultimately what we find is because it's now reverberates throughout the system, that Jimmy starts to help Johnny, Jane, the teacher starts to become empowered. They start to see each other's language changing. This is, Dr. Molina was alluding to this before in some of our studies that we've seen, is that it starts to affect classroom cultures rather than just simply, we create a cultured language in the classroom of solidarity that actually we find takes less time than having to consistently go in and remedy problems, because we're preventing, because that really is the basic ethos of ACE, is that it is a radically preventative system approach at both the individual and systems level. All right, so now let's get to some of the brass tacks. All right, so Dominique, I think this one's yours. I think you've got the next two.
There you go. Yes, thank you. So to elaborate a little more, I mean, we've looked at self and individual, we looked at students, we've looked at teachers, because the teachers are the ones that are out there in the gutters working, right? And so we need to make sure that we have that relationship built with teachers and that we're working with them collaboratively so that we can help students. But also outside of teachers, there's other stakeholders that are in the building that have their own little systems that we also need to work collaboratively with to ensure student success. And so I'll talk about some of those different areas and how we can work through consultation with these different groups and work together as a team. So with teachers, first off, we can encourage them to understand students within like a broader context of their environments. And this in turn will inform like more of their interventions. So oftentimes, and as a former teacher myself, and I taught math. So, there's a lot going on with math, there's state testing, and my lesson plans for that day or that week is important, right? However, sometimes we forget that the student's also taking social studies and English, and when you get in high school, the different classes that they need to take as far as electives. And so when I'm giving homework as an early teacher, I'm not necessarily thinking about what else is going on in that student's world. I just know they need to figure out this algebra before we move on to the next level, right? And so understanding as a teacher and just encouraging them to consider the fact that not only do they have that one class with you, but they have other classes. And even larger than that, they have lunch, they have hallway, they have home life, they have social life, they have relationships. So there's different systems that they have outside of that classroom that they bring with them when they step into that classroom. And so not that teachers aren't compassionate about that, it's just sometimes they need to be reminded of that. And so that's our job, is to continue to encourage them to consider that when they are working with students. And in order for a student or teacher to know those things about the student, we have to encourage relationship. Now, I know training staff, that's the number one thing we push, is that relationship is important. It's the healer of all things. And so we really encourage that. And we'll do different assessments and check-ins. And every teacher I know will say, I have a great relationship with all my students. But as Dr. Molina said earlier, if the student doesn't feel that way, that's not really helping the situation. And so giving them different tips and strategies that they can use to go deeper with students and build a relationship that's outside of the classroom, or math in my case, so that they can get more of a sense of the being of that child and kind of get to understand more of that whole child. But also within that, when you get that child's, that student's whole story, also consider how your classroom management style can impact that student, right? And so like Dr. LT stated earlier, your systems of discipline, your systems of praise, which should be encouragement, impact students differently based on their background and based on the experiences they have. And so the more you know about students and their story, that can help guide you with your management systems. And I'll give an example. I also used to be a behavior specialist, and in the school, and especially in the elementary level, there's a lot of that moving the clip down the color. I don't know if you guys have heard that, but if you do great, you're on green, but as you make a bad choice, they encourage you can fix it, but you have to move that up, right? And then the board that you do that on is all typically in the front of the class. So you get on Dominique for talking too much. That was my problem as a child. You get on me for talking too much. I have to move my clip from green to blue, and it continues to go up. And in my house, if that clip is not on green, that's a problem. For somebody else's house, it may not be a problem. They may be okay until it gets to orange. But anytime that clip was not on green, that was a problem in my house. And so understanding that, and also understanding that, how does that make me feel as a student if I have to get up in front of the class and move a clip that I know is going to get me in trouble, that in my world means that's a very bad thing, and that means that my identity, that I'm a bad person, right? And so considering all those things holistically about a child and all your children that are in your classroom, and how that may impact them. And that's just one example. How you engage with students, whether that is yelling, or when somebody gets in trouble, or calling them out and not having individual conferences with them when there's a behavior issue. Just considering everything, because that child is bringing other things with them in that classroom. And also promoting like a strength-based perspective, encouraging the teachers to identify and leverage students' unique strengths to support them in their successes. And so I know we always talk about growth mindset and things like that, but sometimes I think the language that we use in school settings still kind of promote, still can change and kind of shift a little bit more to a strength-based focus. And I wrote a couple examples here, one of which I stole, or actually both, I pretty much stole from Dr. Molina. But I know, coming from Texas and teaching in Texas, we have a lot of what we call ELL students, right? And so English language learners. And that language in itself kind of makes it seem as that child is deficit of something. They need to learn to speak English, right? And so, but if we switch and shift our way of thinking and start changing our vocabulary, and now I use emerging bilingual student. And I use that because the student is not lacking something. The student already has something, and we're just helping with growth, right? And the fact that they're learning a second language is more than many Americans anyways. And so so an emerging bilingual student is a strength that they have. So how do we use their strengths, being an emerging bilingual student, and then help them grow by learning an additional language? Same thing with being a teacher in achievement gaps. you sit in data meetings all day long and we hear about achievement gaps and the deficits that students have and based on the different minority groups in the building. But how do we look at achievement gaps and shift that thinking to educational opportunities? So instead of looking at this is what's wrong, this is what we need to fix, where do I get to teach? Where do I get to pour into? And so looking at, you know, again, as being a teacher, like you give a pretest to figure out what is it that I need to teach so that they can get what it is they need them to be by the end of this said time. And so just shifting our way of thinking, shifting our vocabulary, and then using that vocabulary when we're talking to teachers and other administrators in the building so that we can then shift that cultural language within the school building. And I know it's not just language, but when you start to shift the language, you'll start to shift the mindsets. And that's when you'll see growth and change happen. And now, so in addition to teachers, we have to work and have a strong relationship with administration, right? Because they are the rule makers and the doer and shakers of the building, right? And so we need to have a very close relationship with them and oftentimes consult with them as well. So in our position, and when I'm saying our, I'm talking about the mental health professionals in the building. So that means school counselors, the social workers. I even include the nurses. We have behavioral specialists, school psychologists. Sometimes we have diagnosticians, depending on where you're coming from. But all of us support staff. Our job is to really stress the importance of social justice and advocacy when we're talking to administration and help them like recognize and address systematic inequities and inequalities, that impact student learning and well-being. Now, that is not always easy work to do. However, I know based on our ethics as a school counselor, that is a requirement for us, right? And so we have to go in there and do that work and be the voice for the students and address those things that we see. And so, and by doing so, we can start by looking at different policies, looking at the attendance policy, looking at the discipline policy, and seeing how does this impact students, especially marginalized students. Doing research in discipline policies, you'll notice that typically Black and Brown, specifically boys, are in trouble and sent to alternative school way more than any of their counterparts, you know? And so it makes me wonder why. Why is that? What is it about that policy that needs to be addressed or need to be changed, right? And with attendance, a lot of times we punish, especially elementary babies, with attendance, like they can get in a car and drive themselves to school. And so, you know, what resources may be needed instead of, you know, whatever consequences given the first time there's an attendance problem? And how can we work with administration to look at those policies and kind of work within to help them understand the different systems that children are working in and how that their policies may impact them. And lastly, emphasize the need to like create an inclusive and culturally responsive learning environment for all types of different students. Now, I say that, and when I've gone to trainings and I've said that, the first thing schools do is what? They'll celebrate the months, right? Which is great. I'm glad you're celebrating, you know, Spanish Heritage Month and Black History Month. You know, that's great to celebrate. But we are Black and Hispanic all year long, okay? And so how can we incorporate things on a daily basis that make, to give all students a sense of belonging, regardless of their backgrounds or their identity? And so that's really what we're needing to be the voice for. And sometimes it may be tiring, but we have to keep working. We have to keep trying because we are their voice and we are there to advocate for this system. And so those are a couple ways that we can do this working with teachers and administrators. Did anybody else want to throw anything in before I move to the next one?
I was just gonna say, like, the inclusive environments, like right now or last week we entered Ramadan. So like, is there a place where your goes to have a safe space so that they don't have to go to the cafeteria to wait for lunch, or their prayer time, etc. So just being aware of all the different identities and advocate for them.
And I want to add to that an awareness of that, right? I think, especially in my most recent school, making every teacher aware, whether they have a student that applies to or not, of what's going on, so that in the future, if they ever have a student that may be celebrating Ramadan, that they understand what that looks like. And so just bringing awareness not only to one particular teacher, but all the teachers, all the staff members in the building. All right, so now how can we work together as a team? I think this is funny because we all like have different degrees and do different things, right? We have different expertise, but we're all the same profession. Like we all have like a lot of different skills, and we're all kind of doing the same things in certain places. And my mantra is always like, why work harder, work smarter, right? So as a team, we can work together and help this shift and this mindset or this climate in a school setting. And so doing so, I'll tell you about some things that we've done at at the schools that I've worked at. But I'm going to speak on behalf of school counselors because again, that's what my trade is. So I'm a school counselor, and so I'm going to speak in that way. But for this can go across for school psychs and social workers and everything else. Okay, so for our team, we typically would have a team meeting once a week, right? Minimal, we talk more, but at least once a week, where we go and we look at different things that are going on with the students and what are going on with the school and what we have on our calendar, right? So we meet as a team once a week. Now, I do recognize that elementary counselors may be by themselves, right? And I can understand it's lonely that way, but you too can meet as a team once a week. At the district that I used to work at in Texas, our director put together something called pods for elementary school teachers. And so what she did was she put like 5 or 6 of us together in the same side of town, because where we worked, one side of town looks totally different than the other side of town. And so we had kind of the same population. And so she required us to meet once a week so that we can get to know each other, but also we could bounce ideas off of each other, and that consultation part, when things are going on, maybe with a risk assessment or something. But it also helped build community. So I'm speaking to you too, elementary school counselors and professionals. So we would meet once a week, share information, different perspectives and insights about different students' needs and strengths and challenges and things like that. Then there was a next level where we actually called it a collab meeting. We called it a counseling collab meeting. And so that's when all of like the support staff, so school counselors, the social workers, the nurses, the behavior specialists, school psych, we would all meet twice a month, so bi-weekly. And we would do the same here, because we would share what's going on our different levels, because the school counselors may be doing tier 1 and tier 2 interventions. But then we also had a therapist on our campus. She was doing tier 3 interventions and just working with each other so that we're working collaboratively. And so that happened twice a month. Then there's another level, the interdisciplinary team meetings. And so we call that MTSS. I know MTSS is something that people are still learning across the nation, but it's very popular. So if you hadn't learned that yet, I encourage you to do so and incorporate that into your campus. But at those team meetings, we would then keep that same collaborative team that we had before. But now we're going to add in teachers. So we're going to add in department chairs or grade level teachers, just one. We don't need all of them. Administrators, the assistant principals. We would also invite our RTI, academic RTI specialists, because again, they had that academic testing information, and we would all meet together for an MTSS meeting once a month. And then this time we discuss more individual cases, so more tier 2, tier 3. And then that's where we started as a group, identifying different trends and coordinating different support strategies. Like for instance, the most recent thing that we found was a lot of our concerns or some of the behaviors, some of the things that we saw with students who were struggling academic, just so happened to be in Algebra 1. So that doesn't mean something's wrong with Algebra 1. That means there's a trend going on. That's where we need to focus and look and see how we can help in that area. But had we not all gotten together, we wouldn't have noticed that Billy and so-and-so and this person's all having trouble in Algebra 1. And so being able to collaborate with each other helped us identify those trends, which in turn help us support those students. And then outside of those meetings, there's professional development opportunities and trainings, especially at the beginning of the school year. If you're not on the agenda for the start of the year meetings, please get yourself on the agenda, regardless of title. But that way, you can at least tell the staff who you are, what you do, and things that you yourself can offer. And then as a team, collaborate on how we can present throughout the year, because just that one time is not enough. So how do we become visible as a helper in this building and a support to the teachers, the staff, and the students? And so those trainings can look like trauma-informed practices, social emotional learning, cultural competence. Sometimes we see teachers up there, doing those trainings, or administrators, which is fine, but we are the professionals that have the expertise in those. So how do we come together to deliver that information? And that'd be a great opportunity to talk about ACE and open up their minds to different ways of thinking and questioning students and things of that nature. And lastly, developing school-wide support programs. We all know that every month there's like a different mental health awareness something, right? There's some kind of campaign going on, or kindness day. And so how do we work together to spearhead those things in the bullying prevention programs? There are so many students in the buildings, and oftentimes our ratios are not what is nationally appropriate. So instead of us, working harder, let's work smarter and work together to spearhead those school-wide support programs. I know with me, I work very closely with our social worker, and we'll either, do small groups together, or we'll say, hey, you take this group, you take this grade level. And that way we reach more students working together, and instead of, like I said, working harder. And so just by integrating the ACE theory in these different ways, and working more collaboratively with support staff and teachers and administrators, we can help advocate for students and support them, and just remind everybody that students are working in a system, and there's different systems inside this building that we need to be considering. Is there anything anybody else wanted to add in? No, we're good.
All right. So up to this point, we've talked a little bit about the background of ACE theory, then we pivoted to what we can do at the systems level, particularly to work with some of the adults and to advocate for better experiences for children. And now what we're going to spend the rest of our time, which we have about 40 minutes, is how to do that, like how to embody that what that we can do. And so we're going to have a couple of opportunities to do a breakout room, and I'm going to give some directions. But as a primer, the reason why we've chosen the skills, the how skills that we have, is we wanted them to be the most accessible, most universally, based counseling skills. So it's not esoteric. It's not something that you have to learn something new. Now, if you're interested in ACE theory and the things that we've been talking about, we have more protracted, extended trainings and opportunities. There's the book, there's the research articles, there's reaching out to any one of the four of us. But we're going to intentionally go into those things that you were taught your first couple of months as a counselor or a social worker or a psychologist trainee, and show how what we alluded to before, how language can change from an individual focused to a systems focused. And so we're going to look at basic reflections. We're going to predominantly focus on reflections of feeling, but there's different types of reflections, and hopefully this is reviewed to everyone. Reflections of content, feelings, meaning, and conflict, which are basically paraphrases, your affective responses, and then also your confrontations. And again, the idea is to transmorgify this from an individual causal focus to a systems environmental focus. And so what you're going to do, and I'll give some examples of this in a moment, is you're going to identify the most relevant personal experience. So that's that embodiment of the self experience. But then there's going to be this causal anchor. And so rather than it be, you did this because, it's the because, or the what is predicated on this co-regulated experience. And again, I'll give an example here in a moment, and it'll probably make a little bit more sense. Then we'll pivot into questions, both open-ended and closed-ended questions, preferably open-ended questions. But more than information gathering, these are inspiring that critical reflections, particularly in how those governors of experience affect us. And so, just kind of as an introduction to these practice activities, we're going to break out into four groups, and each one of us are going to lead these, and we'll give a series of handouts to help work through this. But I'm going to read through the directions, and if you have questions about the breakout activity, you can ask your individual facilitator. We'll take about, by the time I finish with the introductions, it's going to be about 25 after the hour. We'll take about 20 minutes in our breakout groups, and then we'll come back together for some question and answers at our end. I'm not going to be able to get to the psychoeducational activity, but I'll still give you all that handout. That's the first of the 5 lessons that is affiliated with some of those research studies that Dr. Molina alluded to. If you want more of those activities or some of the trainings related to that, you can easily reach out to me or Dr. Molina, but just to get us started in the breakout. So we're going to take a little bit of time, as I mentioned, to practice using our basic skills, but flip them around in a little way, kind of massage them down so that it's no longer a particular individual focus, but it's a systems focus. And because we're really talking, and these are applicable to working with children, but because we're really talking about working with the adult stakeholders today in this presentation, we're going to focus on that side of the equation. But so for example, like I alluded to before, this idea of a reflection of feeling. So as a helper, you might identify and express someone's feeling and then provide a linear kind of causal anchor related to that person's experience of that feeling. So this approach to reflection, it's kind of rooted in this post-enlightenment idea that we're a single person with the agency and volition to freely act upon our choices. And so inspired by this worldview that you were classically taught for a reflection of feeling, you might say something like, you feel distressed because there are too many things to do each day as a teacher. In principle, there's nothing inappropriate or unhelpful about that way of reflecting a feeling, right? It's the classical way that you're typically trained in our training programs. And yet, if we deconstruct this reflection of feeling, the feeling of distress, it exists chiefly in the person as a stable and true experience. It's not sophisticated, it's not dimensional. In a similar way, the anchor part of that reflection of feeling, because there are too many things to do each day as a teacher, suggests that there is a personal, decontextualized like cause of that feeling, that you are responsible for all these things that are happening to you. And so this manner of experiencing emotion is subject to one's personal interpretation, the rightness or wrongness of it, their personal responsibility, and how they can act upon it, like as if they're culpable for the total influence of what it is to be an educator in the school. Similarly, the person is inferred to be solely responsible for any responses, like the feeling responses, the thought responses, the behavioral responses, which then are distanced to the complex and layered prior causes of that experience. But by recontextualizing it through language, it can inspire the respondent to be more curious about one's feelings. As I alluded to before, we're really going to today focus on the curiosity part, but connectedness and compassion are baked in here. But we can inquire about how one connects with the context and is afforded the compassion to respond affectively, cognitively, behaviorally in relationship to their environment in these dynamic ways. And so to illustrate this change in language and how subtle it is, consider an alternative inspired by ACE. Your experience of distress is affected by the various people and obligations tied to being in your school. So in here, we're still identifying the feeling. There's still that idea of there's the self-experience of distress, but the anchor changes, the causal change, and there's not that many more, the words aren't that, you're not speaking longer, effective counseling is trying to maximize client response with the minimal amount of counselor contribution. I always say to my students, the metric of good counseling is oftentimes who's working harder. Is it you, the counselor, or the client? The only difference is we flip the script. It's no longer is the client culpable. And I'm going to say this again. Your experience of distress is affected by the various people and obligations tied to being in your school. And so here we still, again, identify the feeling, but the experience is not an indictment of a solid state, right? Instead, the distress is distributed across circumstance. And there's also the sense of empowering and identifying the kind of courageousness of being able to endure these experiences. And then finally, the anchor distributes the cause, wherefrom the helper can later work with a more complex story. So if you think back to that Jamboard activity that Dominique led us through, slightly altering the language in a more culturally apposite and systems way can be more expansive. It's not just this single answer where we get this pithy information, but instead it invokes and inspires the respondent to be reflective and then look forward into deeper inquiry and conversation. And so what we're going to do is we're going to break up into our groups, and we're going to have a series of prompts that I believe there's a link that we're going to point everyone to.
I'm going to put it in the chat right now for everybody.
Perfect. And so what we're going to ask you to do is open this up. It has a couple of examples for both of reflections, and then also open-ended questions. And then what we're going to do as a group is with your group leader, we are going to represent using either some pre-existing prompts that we created, because we know that, it's been a long day and maybe you don't want to be so bold, or if there are some examples from your school situation currently, that we would then ask for a volunteer to utilize an ACE-inspired systems way of either reflecting or asking an open-ended question. And at the same time, that volunteer will be supported by the other people in the group. And then not the idea of making a better reflection or question, but offering alternatives, right? And so that we hopefully can refine it so that it's both empowering at the individual level, while at the same time having that causal anchor that's more systemic. And so that the hope is at the end, and this is in that spirit of ACE collaboration, contribution, is that we've contributed to multiple really strong responses from folks. And so it also illustrates that idea that there's not just one right way to do this, that there's lots of right ways to experience things. So, and if you have questions inside of your breakout room, we'll try to help, and hopefully it'll make more sense as we do some of these. So we're going to pivot over. Did it make it to the chat? Yes, awesome. So please open that prompt up, and we will go to our breakout rooms. And I guess there's going to be approximately 10-ish of the participants with each one of us. And we will see you all back here at about 5:50.
Or 3:50 for those of us out here.
Would you like me to pause the recording while we're in the breakout rooms, or?
I can handle that.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
All right. Wow, that 25 minutes went super, super fast. I know in my group we had some incredibly rich, or at least as reported by my group, and I hope that was the case with anyone. Just recognizing our time, that we only have 8 minutes. Dominique, do you mind putting the psychoeducational, this is the first lesson of, Citlali, was there 6? I can't remember now. Was there 6 in the manual? There were 5 in the manual. Complete transparency, I don't do this to sell books and those kinds of things, but there's just absolutely no way that we can accomplish all that we want to accomplish in these meetings. The other additional lessons in this activity or in this skill set are found here if you are interested in this type of work. And we also, I'm going to put in my personal email address inside of the chat as well, that if folks are interested, particularly in their districts, if they want the more extended version of this, we tried to jam what really is a multiple day professional development in just a couple of hours. And maybe it was a little bit more ambitious than we wanted or that we anticipated, but we hope that it was helpful. We do have about 5 to 7 minutes. If there are folks who have questions either about the theory or some of the practice application that you did in your small group, or any insights that you had that you believe could be helpful for the total group, and then we'll close up. And you can put it either in the chat, or preferably come off your muted button and ask the whole group so we can hear your voice. All right, so with that, are there any final thoughts from my co-presenters, or maybe even my colleagues from San Francisco State as they're formulating those thoughts? I do again want to thank each one of you all, especially the participants. I hope that this was valuable, and I hope that it at least gives something to chew on and deliberate, and more importantly, maybe it can inform and help support the incredible work that you do. It truly is laudable, and unfortunately sometimes thankless work. But I hope, if nothing else, the takeout is that we impress the importance of empowering individuals as it affects total systems, because it really will take a group effort to catalyze some of the changes that are necessary and to transform our schools. And, you know, I just had this conversation with some of my doctoral students this morning that there's oftentimes, and you know, hesitation to reach out to people in the field who are doing some of this work. Oh, there's Molly's kid. Hey. But you know, we can't do the work that we do without community partners. And if folks in their districts think that this is the type of thing that could be useful in their districts, please consider reaching out to us, whether it's partnerships to do professional development, whether it's consultation, or whether you're interested in having your district or group of counselors participate in one of our studies through training. We're very open to this, because again, it takes a community to make this type of work happen. So we greatly appreciate it.